Welcome back to Prime and Load. Today we're tackling one of the most complex and misunderstood political structures in military history, the Holy Roman Empire of the 18th century. We reference states like Prussia, Hanover, Bavaria all the time in our show, but today we're taking a step back to lay down the vital groundwork so that you know exactly what the empire was, how it functioned, and why it mattered. Forget the overused Voltaire quotes. Today, Alex is going to be explaining to us how this massive swath of German Central Europe functioned less like a traditional absolute monarchy and more like a highly complex federal system. We're breaking down the strict hierarchy of the states, from the dominant Habsburgs to the tiny microstates that relied on the empire for their very existence. And along the way, we're going to explore the intense internal friction of the state jockeying for power, the strange operational realities of fielding a multinational Reichsarmee, and the major turning points that define the empire throughout this century. Whether you're a casual fan of the era or a die-hard student, this is the ultimate primer. Thank you for joining us for A Guide to the Holy Roman Empire, Habsburgs, Electors, and the Reichsarmee. Today we're talking about the Holy Roman Empire. This is something that we've touched on a lot in our other episodes here and there, but we're here today to kind of give a little bit of background so that when we refer to the Holy Roman Empire in the future, our listeners know a little bit more about what the heck are we talking about. And this is a kind of a complex topic. So what is the Holy Roman Empire during the 18th century?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd just like to say at the start of the episode that this one goes out to my student Ian Hoover, who may be the only person I've ever met who is more obsessed with the Holy Roman Empire than I am.
That's a feat.
He is, although he thinks I'm interested much too late. He prefers the medieval Holy Roman Empire. So I will say the Holy Roman Empire can be a complex, sometimes bewildering topic. But when we say the Holy Roman Empire, frequently we mean something that my advisor Catherine Ossesta called German Central Europe, the place where German people and others live in Central Europe, Germans, Czechs, some Poles. That is to say, what we today think of as the nation states of Germany, Belgium, Austria. Parts of Poland today were in the empire. It's a little bit of Hungary. It's a big and complex place that is even more complex in the time. So for American listeners, I don't want to fall back on the oft-quoted Voltaire statement on the empire, which it was not holy or Roman or an empire, which is not very helpful and not very accurate, but a more helpful way of trying to understand broadly the empire is through the American federal system. So in the United States, as hopefully our American listeners will know well, we have a federal government, and then we have state-level governments. These state-level governments are pretty tightly, by the standards of the Holy Roman Empire, under the control of the federal government, but they can autonomously make decisions which affect them. They can pass laws which affect them. In some cases, especially when we look at National Guard units, they have military forces under their control. This is the sort of relationship on steroids, I guess you would say, that you find in the Holy Roman Empire, especially in the 18th century. So that is to say, there are states that have their own military forces. There are states that have a limited amount of sovereignty, or what the Germans would call Landeshoheit, which is not exactly sovereignty as in like the United States or the United Kingdom or Germany today are sovereign states. But a limited degree of sovereignty. So a prince of a minor state within the Holy Roman Empire, and we'll do kind of a tour of the empire maybe here in a moment, would have the ability to make agreements with other princes within the empire, with other foreign powers, as long as those agreements were not directed against the empire itself. So it's sort of like an extremely loose federal system, maybe something more like the United States had under the Articles of Confederation, as opposed to our current Constitution. It's a place that prizes, and this might seem odd, but it's a place that prizes local autonomy, especially in the part of the individual dynasties, a degree of freedom. It's a very skeptical, a place that's skeptical of the centralization of power, a place that is skeptical of large centralized governments that are trying to exert power over local autonomies. The empire is, in some ways, I think there are aspects of it that would seem right at home, or at least familiar to many of our American listeners.
And so in this structure of limited autonomous states, is there like a hierarchy there? Is there a structure, like obviously you compared it to kind of like an American republic? Is there a representative house? Is there a Senate house? Like, how is this all structured, and how are they govern each other or govern together?
Absolutely. So I would say, like the United States, there is executive power and legislative power and judicial power within the Holy Roman Empire. Compared to the United States federal government, the abilities of the government of the Holy Roman Empire to enforce its decisions are very limited. So obviously, if it's an empire, there must be an emperor somewhere, right? And so the executive branch is that emperor, right? Almost invariably, except for a very odd and awkward period during the War of Bavarian Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, you have the emperor is usually the leader of the House of Habsburg, which rules the territorial state of Austria. And so the Habsburg crown lands altogether, usually the Kingdom of Bohemia, especially if we're talking about the empire in the 18th century. And so nominally, the Habsburg family is kind of in charge of the empire in its executive function. They have some degree of power and influence within the empire. You also have the imperial diet, law courts like the Reichsarmee, who are trying to sort of pass laws throughout the empire. But at a local, or again, to kind of continue with this American analogy, at a state level, you also have individual dynasties that conduct, as I've already said, kind of their own policies, their own foreign policy. Some of them, particularly as we move into the 18th century, have their own military forces. And so this is we would not hopefully want to live in America in which, say, the president of the United States was in an open war against the governor of Ohio, but you find in the course of the 18th century that kind of situation can occur. There are prominent local rulers of all those rulers, and I'll go through maybe a list of some of the most important states here in a moment. Of those, none are more important than the Electors, or the Kurfürsten of the Holy Roman Empire, who their job is to select the next emperor of the empire. And so if we have an electoral college in the United States that elects the next president of the United States, obviously our individual votes matter in the United States, but really what matters is who wins the electoral vote. That's also a situation in a very different form that exists in the Holy Roman Empire. You have, depending on the exact year, 7 or 8 or 9 electors of the Holy Roman Empire, representatives of the major princely families of the empire, who meet to cast votes to decide who the next emperor will be. And so usually, almost invariably, this is a candidate associated with the House of Habsburg. Not always, but usually. The Habsburg family is negotiating with these different princely states, trying to maybe buy some of them off, secure their loyalty in order to win these elections for control of the executive branch of the empire. So again, it's a lot going on, but in very broad terms, if you put we understand this is not a perfect parallel. Institutions like the Electoral College, like the federal relationship between the federal government and states in America, might have seemed quite odd to someone living in the Holy Roman Empire in the 18th century, but there would have been aspects of that they would understand and perhaps sort of have some sort of framework for.
Hello listeners, this is Andrew. We often say that history is written by the victors, but on this show we know it's actually written by the supply lines, by the weather, and by the difficult decisions made inside the command tent. Sometimes the most interesting part of our recording session isn't the battle narrative. It's the 20-minute debate or analysis we have between the key actions. If you enjoy those what-if moments, I invite you to become part of the Prime and Load War Room on Patreon. For the price of a pint, you can hear the conversations that usually end up on the cutting room floor. You'll also get access to our newsletter, The Orderly Book, as well as exclusive bonus episodes that cover topics we typically don't get to on the main show. So if you're the kind of person who's looking for more 18th century warfare, join the Prime and Load War Room at patreon.com/primeandload.
You've mentioned a few times that very often the Habsburgs have been in that succession of being the emperor. Why them?
Yeah, so remember when we did the episode on Malvitz, and I was like, when back in the 1200s, when this is happening, no. So, long story short, to some extent, they rule like the 900-pound gorilla of the territorial states. The Habsburg crown lands are the biggest and most powerful territorial state, and so maybe for American listeners, if we understand that New York State or California has a lot of electoral votes based on its population, ruling the largest and most powerful territorial state, having a lot of international connections, having a really big army, having to some extent been successful in the 30 Years' War in the previous century, in the 1600s. All of that confirms the Habsburgs' continued sort of rule of the empire throughout the 18th century. They did not found the empire. They were not even the leaders of the empire for the majority of the Middle Ages, but after about 1400, you do see Habsburg candidates, or maybe 1450, you do see Habsburg candidates coming to the throne of the empire with increasing rapidity, to some extent, because of the empire that Maximilian I and his grandson Charles V secure in Europe as a result of marriage alliances in the 1400s and 1500s. And so in some ways, if Habsburg power is a legacy that continues on in the 18th century, it's kind of founded by these two figures, the Emperor Maximilian and his grandson Charles V in the 1400s and 1500s, respectively.
Looking at the structure again, you said there's a bunch of different smaller states, but you also mentioned there was only a few electors. So it seems like there is a hierarchy amongst these states. Can you kind of tell us who's involved in this empire and kind of what is their status in that empire?
Yeah, sure. So let's just sort of start at the top and work our way down. At the apex of power in the 18th century Holy Roman Empire, you have the lands ruled by the Habsburgs. And so these include things like the Dutch of Styria, Austria, the parts of Hungary, the Kingdom of Bohemia, what we today think of as the Czech Republic, Silesia for the first 40 years, the Duchy of Silesia for the first 40 years of the 18th century is ruled by the Habsburgs. They have the most wealth, they have the most power, they're important on the European stage, not just within the empire. To some extent, it's almost like they're the home team, they're the incumbent, they have a lot of the advantages, they have a lot of the resources, and scholars like Peter Wilson, whose work I drew on a lot as I was kind of writing the notes for this lecture. He's, in my opinion, at least probably the greatest living scholar of the empire in the 18th century. Sort of views them as they're really the people who hold most of the cards. They're the ones who are trying to frequently maybe expand their territory and their influence. If there's a drive for centralization, particularly at this early date, frequently it's coming from the Habsburgs, not coming from other powers in the region. Now, so the Austrians, their territory, the Habsburg family, they're in a class all their own. They're probably the only large state in the Holy Roman Empire, particularly if we start at maybe the beginning of this podcast chronological range in 1700 or thereabouts, the 1680s through 1720s, something like that. The next band of states, at least in the year 1700, is all of what we might call, medium-sized states. These are small states within the empire like Brandenburg, Prussia, or Hanover, or Saxony, Bavaria, the Palatinate, or the Rheinpfalz. All of these have a lot of wealth. They have a lot of power. They have territorial armies that are under the direct control of their sovereign. In some cases, particularly the Prussians, those territorial armies are very significant. They can use them kind of gain more power and influence. And so they use a combination of their size, their military influence, and their legal position with the empire as electors in order to throw their weight around, try and keep the Habsburgs in check, but also try and increase their own power. And so that middle band of states, this medium band of states, it's very important. By the end of the 18th century, if we're telling the story not the beginning of the podcast date range, but as the empire is really kind of getting ready to collapse around the year 1800 under threat from Napoleon, this looks a little different. Prussia has probably managed to eclipse the other medium states, and it's maybe not quite as powerful as Austria yet, but is getting there. Whereas all of the other medium-sized states, Hanover, Bavaria, Saxony, they're just kind of holding on, trying to maintain their power as it is. They're not growing in power in the same way that perhaps the Austrians are, or the Prussians are. And so, with those medium states out of the way, you have and we could do this for the rest of the afternoon. I know we all have stuff to do, so we won't. But we could go into a infinitely smaller groups of states, right? So the next band, people like we're recording an episode on the Battle of Ramillies with General Ewan Carmichael. He referenced the forces of Cologne at the Battle of Ramillies on the side of the French. That is in one of these sort of smaller sized states. Cologne or Köln, Trier, Mainz, these are all that make up the rest of the electors. They're small states led by the church, so the archbishoprics basically. They again have kind of a vote to see who the next emperor will be. And then you have two other small but still significant states of Hessen-Kassel, of course famous to American listeners because they send most of the Hessian forces, which actually come from 6 different states, over to fight in the American War of Independence. And then a state very similar in some ways to Hessen-Kassel, Württemberg, also using sort of what Germans in the 19th century would have called the Soldatenhandel. It was like the soldier trade to loan their forces out to other states in order to gain more wealth and influence and power. They're both in the west of the empire and kind of the south west of the empire. Both of these states are trying to gain power and influence, not necessarily by annexing large swaths of their neighbors' territory or waging wars of conquest, but by being useful allies and sort of selling their soldiers in a strategic way to other people within the empire. Both of these states, by the time the empire collapses, will eventually get the dignity of being an elector themselves. For the Württemberg case, I don't think it's not until 1803, so it's almost gone by then. But they are trying to play this game of increasing in power and status. And then finally, there is just a mass of smaller states that I'm not even really going to mention. Some ones that might be known to some American listeners because they send soldiers to fight against us in the Revolutionary War. Small countries like Waldeck or Anhalt-Zerbst both send a small number of soldiers to go serve for the British, against us in the War of Independence. But by and large, these states, some of them may have small militaries, but there are hundreds of these smaller states. And so individually, they're not very wealthy or very powerful. They don't have a lot of influence. It's almost like a constellation of small countries. The term in German for this is Kleinstädterei. They're ubiquitous. I mean, if you go all the way through the kind of south and west of the Holy Roman Empire, you'll find these small microstates that are, maybe they have military forces, but they're certainly not the major power players of the empire.
To become an elector in the Holy Roman Empire, it doesn't sound like it's like a certain checklist you have to get through. It's when the other electors feel like you are powerful enough. Is that kind of correct?
Not incredibly so. So to some extent, you have it is sort of a perception of how important are these states, but it's a dignity that's granted by the emperor. So you could suppose someone wages a very painful rebellion against you. If you have enough support as the emperor, you could remove their dignity as an elector. And so, to some extent, especially states like Hessen-Kassel and states like Württemberg in the 18th century, they're trying to become large and powerful enough to basically get noticed and stand out so that they will get this dignity of being an elector from the emperor. To some extent, it's almost like a catch-22 sometimes of, do you want to be really supportive of the emperor's policies and sort of gain influence in that direction, or maybe you want to ally with a foreign power like the French to try and have a better shot of supplanting or challenging the emperor and his policies. This is a strategy that folks like the Bavarians pursue in the War of Spanish Succession. It's something that obviously Frederick II of Prussia will do with the greatest amount of success. I would say another major way that you can get noticed within the empire is you could marry your royal family, because you are a small little royal dynasty, to a major power outside the empire. And so it's a little bit weird, but if you think about where do a lot of the royal families of Europe come from in the 18th century? I mean, we call it Georgian Britain because it's the House of Hanover, right, who comes over in 1714 and starts providing the royal dynasty for the United Kingdom, or the Great Britain at that point, right? They're coming over from Hanover. For a period in the early part of the 18th century, the King of Sweden is a Hessian guy. Famously, Catherine the Great of Russia is the princess of Anhalt-Zerbst, right? I mean, so there's a non-zero chance that you could go out and marry into a very powerful royal family across Europe. And probably the best chance of this happening is you could get yourself elected King of Poland. Poland also an electoral monarchy at this point. And so for much of the 18th century, or at least the early half of the 18th century, the electors of Saxony, the Wettin dynasty, are very hopeful that they will gain power and wealth and influence by not just ruling the electorate or Duchy of Saxony, but also ruling the Kingdom of Poland, ruling, in quotes there for our listeners who have listened to the Patreon episode focusing on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 18th century. And so, again, especially for our American listeners, I don't think our listeners in the UK who currently live in a constitutional monarchy will have this same hang-up. But we frequently, as Americans, when we hear the word monarch or king, we frequently associate someone's almost like a dictator like Joseph Stalin. They can wake up in the morning and just have infinite power, execute whoever they want in the country. Throughout much of the Holy Roman Empire, and indeed throughout much of Europe in the early modern period, there are a lot of checks and balances and structures to your authority as a monarch. Things you can do and cannot do. Concessions that your estates and the peasants and nobility and the church can wring from you when you take the throne of a particular country. In some cases, that looks like, it's in Sweden, like a new concession that is granted whenever a ruler takes the throne, takes over from his father, say. In places like the Holy Roman Empire, you get those concessions when the family who wants the throne wants your vote. And so they say, hey, I'm having trouble with the urban law in my part of the Holy Roman Empire. The cities don't want me to tax them as much. If I back you, your family, the Habsburgs, for the next imperial election, will you allow me to maybe go in and rewrite urban law in my territory, so that I'll have some more authority in my own country? So it's a constant and complex negotiation of power and authority across the empire, across the 18th century. This is why I think so many Americans, British, French, especially listeners might be thinking, oh my gosh, this state sounds like an absolute nightmare. It's completely Byzantine in terms of its complexity and structure. What an absolute wackadoo way to run a nation. Well, from the German perspective, this is what establishes freedom and liberty and the ability, to not just have some sort of arbitrary power telling you what to do all the time. It's not perfect. I would say it certainly doesn't guarantee individual rights and liberties in the same way that the American Constitution does, but it's one way of trying to limit a government's power, which is something that folks in the 18th century are concerned about.
So clearly there's a lot of internal struggle from states going to war with each other, siding with outside powers to insert influence. What is it that, we've got one emperor, but besides that, what does make this an empire more than just a bunch of fractious states with a figurehead?
Yeah, absolutely. To some extent, and not that there are not Poles and Czechs, depending on exactly where we are, Italian ethnic people who live in this empire, but to some extent, it's the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation is the official title of this institution, of this organization, and so to some extent, there's a shared linguistic and to some extent ethnic identity. Certainly not a shared religious identity after the 1500s with the Protestant Reformation. That helps keep the empire together. And I'm not trying to say it's just Germany with extra steps. It's clearly not. But I do think this sort of shared sentiment keeps it together. You also do find, especially among the tiny states, especially among the Kleinstädterei, there is this concept of Reichspatriotismus, which is basically, we like the empire because we're a little tiny minnow in a world of giant people trying to eat us. A great decentralized state prevents our little, micronation, which is like the size of a county in the United States, from being gobbled up and eaten by our more powerful neighbors. So to some extent, the people who love the empire the best are frequently the smallest countries in the empire whose autonomy, dynastic integrity are preserved by the structure of the empire itself. You could look at this, and certainly, I'm not trying to be down on our French listeners or our British or Spanish listeners or something like this, but other, more normal, quote unquote, normal is setting on a dryer, really, listeners from those countries might say, wow, the Holy Roman Empire kind of looks like France before it was centralized, like these guys kind of missed the boat. And I think there's maybe an element of truth to that. But I also look at this, and especially for the small states, especially in the west and southwest of the empire, they look at this and say, this is great. This preserves our autonomy. We don't have some sort of Louis XIV telling us how we got to live. The Holy Roman Empire is pretty nice in that regard. And so much like people within the Holy Roman Empire might be chauvinistic in their outlook towards Poland and say, oh my gosh, what an absolutely nuts country. You have to vote on everything. And, these Polish diets can veto legislation at the drop of a hat. That seems like a crazy way to run a country. There are people in Spain and France and England and Sweden maybe who look at the Holy Roman Empire and say, what a crazy way to run a country. There's no centralized authority, and we'll talk a little bit about the military of the actual empire itself here in a second. There is some centralized authority. but it looks very different than the state institutions that exist in these institutions. It's not just that they are deficient or backward. These institutions survive because to some extent they serve a constituency within the empire, these small states that want things to remain as they are.
And so on that topic, can we kind of talk about the armies of these different states?
Yeah, absolutely. So once again, I'll kind of go through and take us around the map, maybe a little bit more explicitly in this tour of the empire. So by far the largest is the royal Habsburg army, so what was often called the royal and imperial army of the Habsburgs. And so more than any other state in both 1700 and in 1800, the largest military power in terms of numbers is the Habsburgs. They have maybe an army that's not always the highest in quality compared to all other states in the empire. But they do have a relatively powerful force in terms of sheer size. And to some extent, their force also increases in quality in the second half of the 18th century. Let's say we're fast forwarding magically to the year 1750. Up in the north of the empire, especially the northeast of the empire, there is a large and emergent, more powerful state that by that point is just known as Prussia. It was once, Brandenburg Prussia. The kings of Prussia after 1701 are blessed in that, in addition to ruling territory within the empire, they also have territory outside the empire. This is something the Habsburgs do as well. I mean, they rule in Hungary, which is not part of the Holy Roman Empire. They also have lands within the Holy Roman Empire. The same is true for the Hohenzollerns in Prussia. And so Prussia is not equal in terms of its wealth or number of soldiers or total population to the Habsburgs, but they do have a very professionalized army. They do have an army that is in some ways, in terms of its quality, the envy of the Habsburgs, the envy of many European states, led by, of course, listeners will know, in the middle years of the 18th century, a very dynamic and king who's often tried to kind of push the boundaries of what's possible within the empire, Frederick II, at least until the latter third of his reign. They're probably another analogy that is frequently drawn. I've been comparing this to America. An analogy that's frequently drawn to describe 18th century, in politics within the empire is that of the Cold War. And in the Cold War, we think of the nations on the side, including the United States, as the first world, the nations of the Eastern Bloc and who support the communists throughout the world, and Soviet Union, of course, the second world, and then the nations that are kind of trying to figure out where they fit into this framework as the third world. And so sometimes scholars will write about the Holy Roman Empire in the 18th century in this same way. The Habsburgs are something like the first Germany, the Prussians are the second Germany, and then everyone else is part of this third Germany trying to sort of figure out where they are in the framework. And so if the Habsburgs have an army of 300,000 men, and the Prussians have an army of 150,000 men, depending on where exactly, what year we are, it might be a lot smaller than that earlier in the century. States like Hanover, Saxony, Bavaria, depending on the exact year, might have armies of 30 or 40,000 men, maybe even a little more than that, depending on the exact year. States like the Hessian, actually talking about the Landgraviate of Hessen-Kassel, they might have an army of 20,000 or more men, larger at the end of the century. The same is true of Württemberg up to a point. I mean, in some ways, they kind of peaked in the 7 Years' War in terms of the size of their military. They are, all of these states are trying to figure out how we're going to use our army and our population and the legal mechanisms with the government in order to try to gain influence. Sometimes that is by supporting the Prussians against the Austrians. Sometimes that is by supporting the Austrians, in their struggle to try and keep Prussia, almost like a lid on Prussia, if we want to think about it in those terms. So doesn't matter who you are, across the empire as a whole, you basically have three goals if you're one of these sort of various states, and that is you want to preserve the dynasty. You want to pass on your state, hopefully intact, to your heirs. You want to defend your existing possessions. You don't want any other potentially more powerful state to come and take your territory. And you also want to try, if you can, increase your status, maybe by becoming an elector, and increase the size of your own territorial holdings. Peter Wilson writes, these are the three goals that, whether you're one of these little tiny, minnow states with an army of 600 men, or you're the Habsburgs with an army of 300,000 men, you're basically pursuing the same objectives. That is to say, preserve the dynasty, pass on that territory to the next generation, defend your existing possessions, increase your status, increase the territory that you control.
Yeah, so the one thing we haven't really talked about yet, so the older states have their armies, and you've talked about a couple of the biggest ones, but the empire itself, of course, also has an army. Is that something that you could fill us in on and add yet another level to this already Byzantine organizational structure?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the 1500s, Emperor Maximilian came in and organized the military of the army into what we in English call circles or Kreise, or districts, you might say. These are not always matching directly to the borders of the territorial states. It's like a group of 10 divisions within the empire. And so each state within the empire, within this particular division, has to contribute forces for almost like a national, or it might be better to say like a federal army within the Holy Roman Empire. And of course, we call this the Reichsarmee, the army of the empire. And so this Reichsarmee, maybe in sort of the same way I've already framed it, if the people who really love the empire as it is are these smaller states, the ones who are really trying to contribute to the Reichsarmee the most, especially by the end of the 18th century, are these smaller territories. They're the ones who say, yes, we like the national government, or like the federal government as it is now. We like the constitution of the empire and the way that it is. We think the institutions are important to maintain. Let's contribute troops to the federal army, or the Reichsarmee of the empire. Now, the Reichsarmee gets a really bad rap. The idea is that because it is a force that is incredibly polyglot, it's made up of soldiers from dozens or perhaps even like hundreds of individual territories. How effective could it possibly be? All these guys may be speaking German. I don't know if that's a guarantee, but may be speaking German. But there's certainly not any sort of unified unit cohesion or cohesion at like a brigade or a division level. I mean, how on earth, or how effective could this army be? And not only that, but all the troops are not equipped in the same way, uniformed in the same way. This is very much it's an army that war gamers are quite fond of doing, because it's almost like a rainbow army. They're wearing in different colors, right? They're equipped with different flags. I mean, it's something that is dizzying in its variety. With that said, it is a powerful check on external threats outside the empire. It's raised a number of times to fight against French threats in the course of the 9 Years' War and the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Polish Succession. The larger states of the empire don't always feed forces or recruits directly into the federal army, particularly as we move forward into the century. Sometimes they just contribute their own soldiers. And so there would be a Hanoverian section of the Reichsarmee. There would be, in the War of Polish Succession, there would be a Saxon or a Prussian contingent in the Reichsarmee. And so you find soldiers from a lot of these smaller states being grouped into units by their district or by their Kreise. You also would find individual units or brigades from territorial states filling out the federal army. Now, if your territorial state is at war with the emperor, which should not be happening, to be clear, but occasionally does happen. I mean, look at the Bavarians, look at the Prussians. Obviously, you're not going to be contributing those troops to the army of the empire, and frequently the smaller states that are trying to kind of play both sides against the middle, maybe as a result of their dynastic connections, maybe as a result of their religious connections, will sometimes try to avoid fighting against the emperor directly. And so when the French and the Habsburgs ally against Prussia in the 7 Years' War, you're in kind of a real headache if you're a state in the west of the Holy Roman Empire, because the emperor is allied to a nation that is sending troops into the empire in order to attack Hanover and Prussia, which are states that are within the nation, but in the case of Hessen, Kassel, and Hanover are not directly fighting against the Austrians. Do we really want to support them? Or do we really want to sort of form our own army? And of course, this is what happens, particularly in the case of the 7 Years' War. There is a large army that's really the nucleus of it is the Hanoverian forces, that British troops and soldiers from Braunschweig, Wolfenbüttel, and other smaller states contribute forces to this army, maybe in lieu of contributing them to the federal army, in order to try and protect the empire from attacks by the French coming in from the west. I'm not going to lie and say this is one big happy family that is a super functional and a place where everything runs smoothly all the time. It certainly, if you are a larger territorial state like the Habsburgs or like the Prussians or the Hohenzollerns, you find that there are moments where you want to tear your hair out, sort of working within the framework of the empire. But I will say, just as often, you can sometimes work within the structures of the empire to accomplish your goals. And so Frederick, for most of his reign, is portrayed, especially by Prussian historians in the 19th century, as someone who wants to come through and destroy this old, archaic framework. He's a modern guy. He's a nation builder. He's this great man. He wants to try and change the story. Well, that might be true a little bit in the War of Austrian Succession in the 7 Years' War, although I think it's probably more accurate to say Frederick is interested in trying to replace the Habsburgs as emperor rather than do away with the imperial system. But by the end of his reign, he's actually working with the little states. He's trying to prevent the Austrians from seizing more territory, trying to sort of prop up the empire as it is in order to get at his principal opponent, the Habsburgs. And so in the War of Bavarian Succession, Joseph II is quite keen to try and add Bavarian territory to the Habsburg lands. This results in Prussia aligning with some of the smaller states to try and prevent this from happening. Again, late in the reign, there's fears about the growth of Habsburg power. Frederick promotes a League of Princes, a Fürstenbund, in order to try and put a check on Habsburg expansion and Habsburg autonomy. And so both Maria Theresa, or Joseph maybe a little bit, and Frederick, they find things and moments in their career or through the 18th century, things they hate about the empire, things they wish were different, especially when they're trying to expand their own territories. But there's things that they love about the empire and things that they use when they're trying to keep someone else from expanding. And so this is a system that maybe saying it works is a bit too strong, but certainly it is capable of preserving the status quo, providing, again, to maybe use a phrase that's common in the Western world, to try and use checks and balances to prevent the empire from being completely dominated by one individual or one territorial state.
Just because you've mentioned the Bavarian succession, Alex, it suddenly occurs to me that I don't recall the Reichsarmee playing any part in that. Is it mobilized at all by the empire in that?
Yeah, it does not play a significant role because as I recall, the Reichsbahn, which is what's necessary to pass which is not trains, but like a band within the empire. It's not passed in such a way that enables the Habsburgs to call upon that in the Diet to some extent, because normally the idea is that the Reichsarmee is called in order to support the Habsburgs, and in this case, I mean, you could kind of make the argument that Joseph II is the one trying to gobble up his neighbor's territory, and so there's not a lot of willingness among the small states, which are very active in the Diet, to say, yes, let's help normally our friends who we like, the Habsburgs, to try and gobble up a large state, which is really the only barrier that would prevent the Habsburg lands from them gobbling us up next. Let's not do that, and so you don't find the Reichsarmee being utilized in a massive way during the War of Bavarian Succession.
You know, Alex, with all this talk of power jockeying back and forth, is there ever a moment where the Holy Roman Empire is unified in one cause against one enemy?
No. In all seriousness, I mean, there are moments where I think if we go further back in time, where maybe during the 30 Years' War, a lot of people within the empire did not necessarily love what the Swedes and maybe the French were doing, but almost throughout the whole run of the early modern history of the Holy Roman Empire, there are territorial princes opposing the Habsburgs, and vice versa. There are conflicts, I mean, going all the way back to the reign of Charles V. He's fighting the Schmalkaldic War in the 1540s, I think, 1546, 1547, against Lutherans within the empire. So no, I don't think I can readily reach for an instance where the entire army of the empire is unified. During the War of Polish Succession, it comes close. I mean, you've got Prussians and Hanoverians and Saxons kind of all contributing to the Reichsarmee in the way that they're supposed to. But no, it certainly doesn't ever appear as one unified nation. There are moments where the majority of the empire is kind of functioning like it's supposed to, but I don't know that we ever see that compliance bar reach 100% or something like this. I mean, that's a little bit much to ask for such a decentralized system.
Sure. In that decentralized system, if it's supposed to work, what's the Holy Roman Emperor? What is his goal in that top, like, as the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire? He's not advancing a political goal or aim of a unified empire, really, because it's not really a unified empire. So I guess for lack of a better question, what's the point of the emperor then?
Yeah, kind of depends on the individual emperor. I mean, if you have if you're facing great external challenges, you might want to try and work with the smaller states. If you're Joseph II, you say, man, it would really suit my state's sort of boundaries great if we seized Bavaria, kind of rounded off a huge chunk of our territory. This would be ideal. To some extent, like I said a little bit earlier in the discussion, everyone from the ruler of the micronation of Anhalt-Zerbst up through the Holy Roman Empire is essentially pursuing those three objectives, right? You're trying to preserve your dynasty. I mean, in the Habsburg sense, you see no better example of that than poor old Charles VI and the Pragmatic Sanction. The goal he has to go around and convince everyone to recognize his daughter Maria Theresa as like the legitimate heir to the empire, even though Salic law forbids her from ruling because she's a woman. You're trying to defend your existing territory against external threats. When we move to the from Charles the Sixth to his daughter Maria Theresa, what's she trying to do? She's trying to hang on to Silesia. She doesn't want the Prussians to come in and seize that after 1740. She wants to try and preserve her territorial state as it exists. Her husband, Francis Stephen, is the emperor after we get rid of the annoying Bavarian interregnum here. And then finally, it moved down to Charles VI's grandson, Maria Theresa's son, Joseph II. He's fulfilling goal number 3. He's trying to expand his territory. I mean, he's already the emperor, so it's hard to get an increase in status when you're already in charge of the whole thing. In charge, quote unquote. But what is he trying to do? He's trying to add more territory, more wealth, more troops to his resources by seizing Bavaria when the old family dies out in 1777. So again, from the absolute, I won't call them bottom feeders because I have some wonderful reenactor friends who reenact his Anhalt-Zerbst. So from the very small states all the way up through the people who are at the apex of power in the empire, you do see people pursuing these same 3 goals. At least that's Peter Wilson's argument in his excellent book on Württemberg in the 18th century and kind of their state, their society, and their military.
We talked a little bit about the formation of the Holy Roman Empire in the Middle Ages. Can you, if it's possible, to kind of give us a bit of a roadmap of some of the major events and turning points that the empire goes through during the 18th century?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that just across the bounds of the century, you have the fundamental turning point is the Prussian seizure of Silesia in 1740. I mean that's the moment where they another state actually begins to seriously, in a deadly, threatening way, challenge Habsburg supremacy in the empire. You could make a similar argument in the War of Spanish Succession for the Bavarians. They're obviously way less successful in doing that, both in the War of Spanish Succession and the War of Austrian Succession. If they had succeeded, maybe we would be telling a story of Catholic Bavaria unifying with some sort of German nation as opposed to sort of Protestant Prussia doing this. But militarily, that doesn't go their way. So I would say fundamentally 1740 is kind of a big turning point, at least in retrospect. You also have significant outside threats. The empire is frequently at war with the armies of Louis XIV. In the early part of the period, I mean, Louis XIV is all the way back into the 1600s now, in the later part of the 1600s, running up to the fighting in the War of Spanish Succession and Ramillies that we heard about from General Carmichael. Louis XIV is seizing imperial territory. He's taking imperial cities. He's devastating the Palatinate, killing civilians and wasting and burning down villages, across the western portion of the Holy Roman Empire. So the challenges that he presents in the early part of the century are almost like the big sort of start to imperial history in the 18th century as you're trying to get through this period of French expansion, dynamic aggression in the period of Louis XIV. From there, the threat moves from being more of an external threat, although the French are still quite present, of course, as the Bavarians are trying to shake things up in the War of Austrian Succession, to a more internal threat against the Prussians, which by the period of the 7 Years' War, Maria Theresa has decided my greatest enemy is not the French or the Bavarians. My greatest enemy is the kind of threat of emergent Prussia, having seized part of my territory, right? She's failing in the second of her objectives of all 3 rulers within the empire. And so she's trying to hold on to her patrimony. It's a great shift. By the later part of the century, I mean, you could look at the War of Bavarian Succession. You could look at some of the challenges, especially in the Revolutionary period going forward, maybe out of the framework of this podcast into 1800 and beyond. There are some significant moments where the empire is coming under strain, where there are periods of maybe centralization, creating new electors to try and sort of keep the whole thing together. But as Lee, kind of some of your questions have been pointing to, I mean, in a state this fragmented, that is under strain from this many different directions, it does sort of seem like it's only a matter of time before eventually the whole thing might come crashing down. Now, I will say it takes a figure as dynamic as Napoleon to make that happen. Without Napoleon, we could be talking about the Holy Roman Empire enduring into the middle of the 19th century or something like this. But a combination of the weaknesses inherent in the system, as well as external pressures from the French Revolution, from Napoleon, bring the whole thing crashing down by the time we reach 1806. So this is in some ways maybe three big moments throughout the century that people are trying to deal with. Louis XIV in the early part of the century, the threat presented by emergent Prussia, and to some extent the Bavarians in the War of Austrian Succession and beyond, and then finally the French Revolution and the collapse of the empire as we reach 1800 and 1806. For the smaller states, there are individual turning points. If you're Saxon, there's no greater dismay than the fact that you don't get reelected King of Poland right after the 7 Years' War. They would view this as a crucial turning point, and perhaps it is in the history of the entire empire. The ability of both the Württembergers and then the Hessians, the Hessen-Kassel, to try and use their soldier trade, which is a pretty loaded term, but their subsidy agreements with various powers across Europe and indeed all the way over to America, in order to gain wealth, influence, prestige. This is they would look at, maybe 1776 is a big turning point for Hessen-Kassel. Maybe 1756 is a big turning point when they get these contracts to sort of work for the British. These are big moments for them. But across the empire as a whole, I would say the early period dominated by threats from Louis XIV, the middle period dominated by threats from Frederick the Great, the collapse, French Revolution, and Napoleon. These are the big kind of hinge moments in the history of the empire in the 18th century.
Could I just zoom in on the middle one of those, Alex? I mean, it struck me as you were framing it, and I think you're right the way you present it, but it maybe says something about how notional an emperor the Bavarian Charles VII actually was. That it's a bigger threat that Prussia's trying to nick Silesia than it is that a Wittelsbach has been made emperor. I mean, is he emperor in anything but name? How much of the mechanism of the empire is he actually able to control in his brief tenure?
Yeah, I would say that he's emperor in more than just name. I think it is kind of a shock that to a lot of the smaller states that don't have the electoral power that a Bavarian now has replaced the Habsburgs, who've been in charge since the 1500s and before. So it is. I'm not trying to downplay that moment in terms of its importance. But to some extent, like if you want to play with the big boys, you got to have a lot of money, a lot of resources. And I'm not saying that the Bavarians don't in the that pivotal period in the early 1740s, but their army to some extent has not fully recovered from the War of Spanish Succession. By the time we get into this period, 20, 30 years later, really in the 1740s. I'm not saying he was doomed to failure, and as I recall, passes from disease. So maybe if things had been a little different, he might have secured the next vote of electors for his dynasty. I think that would be a fairly large ask. But the trouble is, a lot of the smaller states and particularly the other electors, by the time, if you look at the constellation of sides in the War of Austrian Succession, Saxony switches sides, right? And so the weird thing about the empire is you're always kind of looking over your shoulder thinking, who do I really need to be worried about? Who is actually my main threat? And so when Silesia is seized, to some extent, I think the Saxons look at this and say, wow, there goes our hopes for some sort of land bridge to Poland, trying to solidify our rule in that country. That causes them to once again align with the Habsburgs. I'm not saying it all comes down to numbers, military resources, things like this, but the fact that Prussia is able to sustain long periods of warfare against the Emperor, against the Reichsarmee, against other powers in Europe in the 7 Years' War, I think I can't, and maybe I'm being really chauvinist against the Bavarians here, so I apologize to our Bavarian listeners, but I can't imagine Bavaria doing that same thing, sort of holding off the resources of much of continental Europe for a period of 6 or 7 years. I mean, it's a big ask for Frederick. He very nearly goes down in defeat in this war. And so I think it maybe just goes to the idea of the resources of all of these middle states are sort of marginal. They're just barely on the cusp of being important within the empire. And so the fact that the Prussians are able to do it in a more of a sustained way comes down to the wealth that Frederick William I was able to save up, comes down to the army that he builds. To some extent comes down to Frederick's talents. I know that's maybe a controversial statement. We'll get some nasty listener emails as a result of me saying that. So that's probably why I would classify the Prussians as a more major threat than the Bavarians are in the 40s and 50s.
All right, so it seems like, well, first off, Alex, it seems like the 18th century is a pivotal century for the Holy Roman Empire, and there's an enormous amount of information that goes along with all of these little and big states. It seems like there's a real possibility to do a huge series. So if that's something that our listeners would like to hear, please, we've got a text the show in the description of this episode. If you want to hear more about some of these states, Hanover, Saxony, Austria, Prussia, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Alex, but that might be something we'd be capable of doing.
Yeah, I mean, folks want, some of the Hessians to connect with some of the anniversaries going on in America. Yeah, a cool thing to do. Just, for sure, let us know. That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with a link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date on the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, formerly known as X. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Artie Sun, and Adrian Berenegger. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.